Hey, folks, and welcome to our Chapter 5 Civil Rights. So, here's what we're going to do with this one. We're going to go through the notes, the information that's in the textbook, but we're also going to go a little beyond that because what I want to do is make sure that when we talk about civil rights, that you know more than just, who this guy is. And I don't think our school has done a great job of basically giving you some of the history of the civil rights movement beyond just the elementary basics of it and stuff. So we're going to make sure that we focus on some of the big events that have happened in the civil rights movement going back to the 1950s up until, well, present day. But let's go through the textbook stuff first, okay? And when we talk about the textbook, we got to talk about the struggle for equality. And this is the interesting component of it. We just naturally assume that it's in there, but it's not in the Constitution. Right? Equality is not in the Constitution at all. It's not mentioned in the Constitution. It's not even mentioned in the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. We don't actually see equality being mentioned at all until the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is one of those, don't overlook that amendment. It's used all the time in Supreme Court cases. First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, 14th Amendment. That's pretty much what the Supreme Court looks at most of the time. That 14th Amendment does a number of different things, but one of the things it does is it guarantees everyone equal protection under the law. So it's the first time we get this concept of equality being brought into the Constitution, and that wasn't until the 14th Amendment, which didn't come until after the Civil War. So when we're looking at this, whether or not a law or a rule or a local ordinance is basically violating the concept of equality, there's something that the Supreme Court has come up with. It's called the standard of review. Up at the top, it basically looks at, like, here's your classifications, and then how difficult is it to basically restrict or prohibit based on that classification. So if we look at, for example, the top, race and ethnicity, if you're going to have a law that basically only allows like white people to do it, not African American to do it, or something along those lines, that's going to be inherently suspect. It's very difficult to basically justify why a law would state such a thing. What's the goal that it's trying to accomplish? And it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to say that you could accomplish this goal only by dividing the races, right? A good example of this would be segregation of schools. Clearly, you cannot have segregated schools in this day and time, right? That would be inherently suspect. Second, the next one down is what we would call intermediate scrutiny. It might be based on something like gender. Where you can basically say that this relationship is directly linked to an important government goal. An example of this one would be the draft. The fact that the United States government only drafts men and not women. Even though they're allowed in the military, even though they're allowed in combat roles, we still don't have women eligible for the draft. Maybe we need to start looking at that. Hashtag feminism. All right, the third one is others. It's like if we basically an example of this would be when I see at gas stations around schools where they'll have a sign up that says no more than 3 students allowed at a time, kind of thing, or no backpacks allowed. Now, I can guarantee you that they're not going to stop me from carrying my backpack into a quick trip, but they're going to stop you. And I guarantee you that there's no other group of people that could put into that category of students that would make this constitutionally okay, right? They couldn't say no more than 3 African Americans in the store at a time, no more than 3 senior citizens, because it's laughable at how ridiculous it even sounds. But they can do that for you. And the reason why is because there's a legitimate goal that they're trying to accomplish with that. And unfortunately, the goal of that is that they think you're criminals. So, congratulations. All right. So if we're looking at African Americans and civil rights, and we're going to be looking at that predominantly throughout this chapter, we have to start with the concept of slavery. We have to start with the beginning of our country, really. But for us, we're going to be looking at the politics of it. So the first thing that they're going to start talking about is the Dred Scott ruling in 1857, where Dred Scott, he was a slave in the southern state. His owner took him up into some of the free territories during this time period. And basically, once he got into the free territory, he sued and argued that he is now in a free territory. He's now a human being. He's now a free man. And the Supreme Court ruled that, nope, you're not a human being. You have no constitutional rights whatsoever. You're property. So, ouch, right? And then we get the Civil War, 1861, 1865, where we had a bunch of southern states basically break away from the United States. They became traitors to the United States of America. and they basically tried to start their own independent country. And Abraham Lincoln basically used the United States military force to force them back into the United States. And while people like to argue in this day and age that they didn't do it over slavery, they did it over state rights, sure, no, that's not true at all. It was about state rights to have slaves, right? That's what this was about. And if you don't believe me, you can look at those 11 states that broke away in the very beginning, and you can actually read their proclamations of independence, why they basically broke away from it. And almost every single one of them mentioned slavery, slavery, slavery over and over again. So we can't change history. What they did was wrong. It's embarrassing. They should fess up to it. Then we get the 13th Amendment, 1865. This was the amendment that was passed during the Civil War, or right after the Civil War. And basically what it did is it outlawed slavery. There's a movie that's called Lincoln. Maybe you've seen it. It's long, it's slow, but what it does is it does a nice job of showing just how difficult and complicated it was to even get the 13th Amendment passed, which you would think would have been easy to pass, but it wasn't something we were willing to admit even after the Civil War. Then we get that horrible era of Reconstruction. Just this long period where we see Northerners go down into the South, take advantage of the havoc that was going on down there shortly after the Civil War. The big thing that we want to talk about here are the Jim Crow laws, and then we're going to take a look at the Supreme Court ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson. So Jim Crow laws are just those generic laws. It's a title for generic laws of what we talk about. What we're talking about there is we're talking about segregation. When people talk about Jim Crow laws, they're talking about segregation. They talk about separate fountains. They're talking about separate school buildings, a separate place to eat at a restaurant. So they're talking about separate park benches. We're talking about how Black people couldn't use the parks or the swimming pools, right? We're talking about all these different things that made the United States segregated during this long period of time up into the 1950s and beyond. There's a couple of great books out there that basically really look at this and what it was like during that time period. I'll put some links to in our little classroom, Google Classroom. All right, 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. We had a situation where Plessy, he was basically riding on a train. He was considered to be Black, although he had mixed heritage. But by the law, he was considered to be Black, and he was basically told he was a white-only railroad car and had to leave. He became a lawsuit. He got arrested. Lawsuit went up to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal facilities were constitutional. Okay, and that's going to be the precedent that the Supreme Court's going to use from 1896 all the way up to Brown versus the Board of Education, which is one of our cases that we have to look at. So Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, that's important. The fact that it happened in Topeka, Kansas is important, and we always leave that out. Brown versus the Board of Education. It's Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. 1954. And the reason why Topeka, Kansas is significant is it wasn't Birmingham. It wasn't, something in someplace in Alabama or in Mississippi, someplace in the deep South where segregation was deeply rooted and, racism was deeply rooted. It was in Kansas, and little Linda Brown's school that she went to, her all-Black school that she went to, was a good school. It was comparable to the other white schools in that neighborhood. What they didn't want, and by they I mean the NAACP, who helps bring this lawsuit to fruition, what they didn't want is they didn't want it to be focused on the building. They didn't want it to be looking at whether or not it's decrepit, whether or not it has running water, whether or not it has good electricity and stuff like that. They wanted it to be about the concept of segregation. So they had millions of people that they could have chose to be their Supreme case, and they chose Linda Brown in Topeka, Kansas. And it's actually a number of families, but Linda Brown's name gets first. Okay, and the Supreme Court is a thing. It's an amazing Supreme Court case where originally it looked like the Supreme Court was going to rule against Linda Brown, and then the Supreme Court justice dies. A new Supreme Court justice gets placed in there, and then he's able to completely change the outcome of that with the way he wrote his his opinions. And what we have then is, at the end of it, we have a 9-0 ruling in favor of Linda Brown. And the Supreme Court basically says that separate but equal is inherently unequal. That's your one line for that. Separate but equal is inherently unequal. And they say that public schools should proceed with all deliberate speed to desegregate. And so what did they do? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. This was 1954. The American people, most of the American people, they weren't ready for this, especially in the southern states. They weren't prepared for this. They weren't willing to accept this. And so most of them did absolutely nothing. They ignored it. They dragged their feet. They did everything in their power to keep it from happening. And we've looked at this before, but this graph shows you the percent of black students who attended school with any white students in the southern states. And right here's Linda Brown. This is Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. And you can see that it basically stays unchanged for 10 years. And then the Supreme Court comes back and basically revisits this in the 1960s, and they start to insist that the obstruction of their Supreme Court ruling has to come to an end. And we see the government, including the federal government, basically stepping up and requiring these southern states, especially those southern states that we were talking about, they have to basically start to desegregate as quickly as possible, whether they want to or not. And we literally see U.S. troops sometimes and state troops basically going at it to make sure that this happens. But you can see it's amazing that in the first 10 years, virtually no change whatsoever. Okay. All right. When we come back tomorrow, we'll take a little look at the civil rights movement and public policy and what that had to all entail during the 1950s and 60s, especially. As always, if you have any questions, make sure you reach out to me through an email or through Google Classroom. And as always, stay safe and wash your hands. We'll see you guys.